Our scripture passage today for the sermon comes from the Gospel of Matthew. I'll be reading chapter 11, verses 16 through 19. But to what shall I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to their playmates. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is justified by her deeds. Well, today is the second sermon in a series that I'm calling Jesus in Beckville, USA, where we are making the case that the only way to transform our community is to offend sinners with the gospel, because Jesus' holiness offends sinners. Now, the reason this is a problem for us in Beckville, USA 2025 is because we live in a culture where almost everything is tolerated and many things are accepted that shouldn't be accepted, except offending another person. Punch me, kick me, burn my house down, but whatever you do, don't offend me. And further, don't ask me to offend anyone else. And so I know that just saying that the gospel is offensive and requires that we offend sinners gives some of you heart palpitations. You may not have to offend someone. Anything but that. In our culture, giving offense is always a bad thing. And it is a sure way of living a lonely life. But when it comes to transforming our community with the gospel truth, hear me, it's not possible for genuine change to happen without giving offense to sinners. And so part of what we're trying to get past with this sermon series is the fear of offending our neighbors, our friends, and our family by bringing the authentic Jesus of the Gospels and everything about him that offends to Beckville, USA. So maybe that's the bad news for us Christians who are people pleasers. Gospel transformation requires offending sinners with Jesus. Not your bad attitude or your difficult personality, but with the person of Christ. This means that the good news for us who struggle with the prospect of offending others is that when people hate you for offending them with the gospel, it's not about you. It's about the one you represent. The world hates us because it first hated Jesus. And they hated him so much that they killed him. Why? Because he's God. And sinners cannot coexist with a holy God. Jesus is just as offensive to sinners in Beckville today as he was in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. And while the gospel is offensive to sinners, Jesus himself promises a blessing to those who are not offended by him. Just a few verses earlier in the passage that we just read. The world is offended by Jesus. We are not. Today we're going to dig into the peculiar nature of Jesus' social life. The people he associated with and what he did when he was with them. One of the main reasons that the scribes and Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of their day, were offended by Jesus was they were shocked by how he lived. He frequented dinner parties with the outcasts of first century Jewish society. Now, why is this a problem? Well, he's a rabbi. And Jewish rabbis aren't supposed to go to parties with tax collectors and sinners. They're supposed to congregate with the righteous. But Jesus' mission, as he tells us, is to call sinners, not those who believe they are righteous. So we followed a different song. We say we have the same march to a different drum or beat. Jesus marched to a different beat than the culture of his day and sung by his generation. The main idea that I have before you today is this: Jesus is offensive because he listens to the song of God's wisdom and not the songs of this generation. I have 2 points today. Bruce said that I was going to cause some of you to faint by saying that. Here's my 2 points: the songs of this generation, and secondly, the song of wisdom. Let's take a look at the songs of this generation. But to what shall I compare this generation, Jesus says? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to their playmates. We played the flute for you, and you didn't dance. We sang a dirge, and you didn't mourn. Jesus is drawing on an analogy to help the crowds he is speaking to understand why people did not receive John the Baptist very well. Remember that John has been arrested when Jesus is talking and imprisoned by a guy named Herod the Tetrarch. And Herod, and this is all, by the way, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So John's arrest and imprisonment coincides with the launch of Jesus' ministry, not coincidental, by the way. And so we read in Matthew's gospel that Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Luke gives us more information about the reason for this arrest and imprisonment. But Herod the Tetrarch, we're told, who had been reproved by him for Herodias, his brother's wife, and for all the evil things that Herod had done, added this to them all, that he locked up John in prison. Herod arrested and imprisoned John because John, get it right, had been preaching against Herod's evil deeds. But the tipping point was when John spoke out against Herod's marriage to Herodias, his brother's wife. Herod would eventually behead John to quench the grudge Herodias had against John for shaming her in public. In other words, John's gospel preaching included the condemnation of evil rulers and their deeds. John was doing what preachers in our culture are not supposed to do. Talking about politics. Because John saw that the gospel message was not something that only applies to certain aspects of culture. John saw the gospel as a set of lenses through which all of life is viewed. The gospel answers the question of how a life should be lived because it illuminates the nature of reality. But John's message flew in the face of the first century Greco-Roman value system, which included all kinds of corrupt practices. I won't go into them all, but let's just say that the Roman culture of that day had degenerated to a very dangerous place, reminiscent of many of the things that are going on in our American culture. And so the gospel was contrary to that culture in which it arose out of. Now to Jesus' analogy. Jesus compares his generation to children who are upset that their playmates are not responding to their music the right way. They first play a song on a flute, which is a happy instrument. You ever heard of flute? No, it's a happy instrument. It's an instrument in this culture that people use to play songs at weddings. Because it was upbeat and it was happy. They want their playmates to dance when they play the flute. But their playmates don't play along. Then they sing a dirge, which is a funeral song. Because they want their playmates to mourn. But their playmates aren't playing the game. They won't mourn. Dancing and mourning. Comedy and tragedy. Happy and sad. What's going on here? What these children are saying is that we want you to be happy about the things we are happy about, and we want you to cry over the things we are sad about. And Jesus says that this generation is like those children. And by extension, every generation is like those children. Our generation is like those children, isn't it? Our 2025 American culture wants us to mourn good and celebrate evil. Murdering innocent babies in the womb is not just a right, it's a privilege to be celebrated. Mutilating your body so that you deny the very identity with which you were created is courageous and heroic, we are told. Relationships between same-sex partners is love and something to proudly proclaim. John the Baptist refused to dance to Herod's evil deeds. Instead, he mourned them, and he was brutally murdered for it. Do you think this age will spare us when we refuse to dance, when they say dance, and cry when they say cry? The slippery slope of sin is always the same. Permission leads to approval, leads to celebration. Look at the so-called gay marriage in our culture. It started with rights. That wasn't good enough. Then they needed approval. People must approve of us or else you're a bigot. But approval wasn't enough. Now you must celebrate us or else you are homophobic and a Nazi. If you are dancing to this generation's flute and mourning this generation's dirge, beware. The game never ends. This generation's wedding song is the next funeral dirge. Following the song of God's wisdom as opposed to the music of this generation means that we will dance when the world is mourning, and we will mourn when this generation is dancing. Jesus said, "For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is justified by her deeds." Notice that Jesus contrasts John's social life with his own. John lived the life of an Old Testament prophet. He lived in the wilderness, wore a garment of camel's hair, and ate strange things. We're told that he subsisted on a diet of wild honey and locusts. Jesus even calls John Elijah. Jesus, however, is far more domestic than John. Jesus loved a good dinner party. Can you imagine John at a dinner party? Who's that guy in a camel's hair sweater knocking back bugs dipped in honey? I don't think he would fit in very well. But the gospel writers tell us that Jesus frequented many social events in the homes of people he shared the gospel with during his earthly ministry. But he didn't restrict himself to dinner parties at the homes of well-respected members of the community. No, he regularly attended dinners at the homes of people who were considered the outcast of society. The accusation that Jesus repeats here sums up the lies that the religious leaders were spreading about him. Lie number one was that because Jesus attended dinner parties, he was a drunk and a glutton. Lie number two was that Jesus' friends were all tax collectors and sinners. Now, Jesus doesn't deny those accusations. Instead, he responds with a rather cryptic proverb, doesn't he? Wisdom is justified by her deeds. With this response, Jesus alludes to the entire Hebrew wisdom tradition. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, all of those are included in that Hebrew wisdom tradition, which often personifies or gives human attributes to the abstract concept of wisdom. Wisdom in the Proverbs is a she who does things as Jesus portrays her here. In the matter of Jesus and John's dietary customs and social life, wisdom informs not only what they will eat, but also with whom they will eat and when they will eat. As Luke tells us, John did not eat bread or drink wine. Jesus did. John did not attend dinner parties with the outcast of society. Jesus did. And even though they made different choices about what they ate and with whom they ate, both Jesus and John were operating from godly wisdom because of their actions. They chose to listen to the song of wisdom instead of the music of this generation. And what this meant was doing things that the world does not understand. When the generation of first century Jews and Romans thought Jesus should be mourning, he was dancing. And when they thought he should be dancing, he was mourning. Because he was living by the eternal truths of God's wisdom, which never change. And they were living according to the music of each generation, which changes from one age to the next. Now, because Jesus was listening to the song of wisdom, he embraced opportunities to reach people whose hearts were ready to receive the message of the gospel. And this mission-minded focus led him to social events at the homes of people of ill repute, such as tax collectors and sinners. Over and again, the religious leaders of Jesus' day accused him of being the friend of two groups of people ostracized in the first century Jewish community: tax collectors and sinners. Jews, especially rabbis, were not supposed to consort with such people. They were considered dirty. Jesus does not just consort with them. We even have an example of him inviting one of these kinds of people to be a part of his special school, rabbinical school of disciples. And that man's name was Matthew. All three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, give us the story of how Jesus called Matthew as his disciple. And Matthew was a tax collector. And tax collectors were viewed as traitors to their own country because they were Jews working for the Roman Empire. an oppressive, occupying military and governing force in Israel. The Jews hated and resented the Romans. It was the unlucky job of a tax collector to collect taxes for the Romans from the Jews on the basis of a percentage of their income. Sound familiar? These tax collectors had a reputation for abusing their positions of power to extort their own people and thus enrich themselves. And so they were despised and rejected, ostracized by most Jews in the community. And Jesus comes along and sees Matthew, who is also called Levi, literally sitting, quote, sitting at the tax booth. In other words, he's actively engaged in this occupation that makes him a hated member of his own community. And while Matthew is plying his trade, collecting taxes from his fellow Jews on behalf of the Romans, Jesus calls him as his disciple to follow him, and immediately Matthew leaves everything to become Jesus' disciple. Now Matthew is so excited about this newfound faith that he decides to throw a great party at his house in Jesus' honor. As one would do when throwing a grand party, Matthew invites all of his friends, who also happen to be tax collectors and other disreputable people of society. Because those are the only kinds of people who would befriend a person like Matthew. Well, Jesus doesn't say, oh, thank you, Matthew, I appreciate the invite, but I'm not going to be able to attend. I've got a prior engagement. No, Jesus is there. He gets the invite and he goes to this dinner party. And as happens in small towns, nothing gets past the religious leaders, who take special note that Rabbi Jesus is partying with the wrong people. The gospel writers all relate their accusation, which is cleverly disguised as a question. Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? The accusation is that only a person who is like a tax collector and a sinner would hang out with him. Birds of a feather flock together. Therefore, Jesus must be like them. To which Jesus responds, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus' response includes an analogy to drive home his answer. To get well, a person has to first realize that he or she is sick, has a sickness that cannot be healed without a physician. A person who knows he is sick realizes his need for a physician, someone outside of himself to come and provide healing. A person who thinks himself well sees no need for a physician. Jesus then quotes a line from the prophet Hosea, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. The entire verse reads like this, I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice. The knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. The point of Hosea's prophecy is that God desires inward transformation of the heart, such as mercy or steadfast love and knowledge of God, over external religious activities such as sacrifice and burnt offerings. The Pharisees who were accusing Jesus were experts at external religious activity. They believed that their right standing for God could be achieved through obedience to the law. And so Jesus comes along and he blows up their world by making the connection between external religious activity of obeying the law and the inability to see one's own sin. People who believe that they are righteous because of their religious activity don't need God. There is nothing worse than religious pride. It's only the people who know how desperately sick that they are who see their need for the great position, that without God there is no hope of healing ourselves. Sin is a terminal illness. And Jesus is saying that the tax collectors and sinners know better than anybody else how much they need God. And unlike the religious leaders of the day who think that God needs them and they don't need God. And so over and over again in the Gospels, we see Jesus doing things like this. He's hanging out with disreputable rejects of society because he's listening to the voice of Lady Wisdom and not the songs of this generation. Luke's Gospel also includes another incident where Jesus is at another dinner party, this time at the house of Simon the Pharisee. And a woman of ill repute, probably a prostitute, comes up behind Jesus and begins to weep as she's listening to him talk. She's so deeply moved by Jesus' words that she begins wiping his feet with her hair as her tears are covering Jesus' feet. And the way this worked, by the way, is when in that custom, the reason why this could happen is because when they sat, they reclined at tables. And so they had these cushions, and so they had their feet kind of kicked out behind them like that. And so she's standing behind him, weeping. And she begins to take her hair and wash his feet with those tears. And she has an expensive bottle of ointment that she begins to anoint his feet with. Now when Simon sees all this happening, he thinks to himself, if Jesus was really a prophet, he wouldn't be letting a woman like that touch him. Because he would know that she's a prostitute. And Jewish rabbis aren't supposed to let women touch them, especially prostitutes. So Jesus looks at Simon. He says, Simon, let me tell you a story. Now, when Jesus says, let me tell you a story, he's got you in a corner. Get ready. All right? It's coming. He says, a certain moneylender had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And when they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? So Simon says, well, of course, the one, I suppose, who canceled the larger debt. And Jesus says, you've judged rightly, Simon. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house, and you didn't even give me any water for my feet. But she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss. But from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet, the dirtiest part of my body. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Then those who were at table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Friends, the only appropriate response to Jesus is complete adoration and worship. Simon treated Jesus like another dinner guest when Jesus showed up for dinner at his home. This prostitute treated Jesus like the most honored guest that one could ever have at your dinner table, and it wasn't even her house. Why? Because she recognized the size of her debt that God had forgiven. She knew that it was a debt she could never repay. This is why Jesus sought out the tax collectors and the sinners. Jesus came not to call the righteous but sinners. If Jesus arrived at your house today, would you weep or would you dance? Did you know that Jesus wept so you could dance? He endured an unimaginable sorrow so that you could experience eternal bliss. Your only hope of true happiness is found in Him. Blessed is the one who is not offended by me. Simon was offended by Jesus. He left sad, and a prostitute left happy because she was not offended by Jesus. This means that when the world is mourning, you can dance. And when everyone else is dancing, you can mourn. The world will hate you for it, but when you hear the song of wisdom, the music of this generation goes quiet. And your life begins to reflect the mission of Jesus' kingdom, to call sinners and not the righteous. Following this song may mean that you dine with the most hated members of our society. Drug dealers and prostitutes and thieves and ex-cons, while refusing the invitations to elite dinner parties with the most respected members of society. Lady Wisdom's song will lead you to search for the lost, like the poor widow who lost her coin, or the shepherd who left 99 sheep to gather the lost one, or the father who welcomes home his son who was once lost but is now found. Do you share God's heart for the lost? If so, your deeds will show the world whose song you're really listening to. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.